So, for those of you who may or may not know, I am a supporter of UBI. UBI stands for Universal Basic Income. So, essentially, what this would be? Essentially, as soon as you reach a certain age, the government automatically starts paying you a wage. And this is not to replace things like, like job seekers, universal credit, or anything like that. Those would run in parallel because, again, these people need support. But ultimately what this would do is this would help support those with the lowest amount of income. And here's the thing, multiple studies have been done on UBI, and they've all shown that UBI is an absolutely fantastic success for the citizens and those people in those areas. And in fact, one of the biggest things that very often comes out of this, by the way, is the number of people from low income backgrounds who finally actually have enough money to start making things into a full-time job. Many of them maybe had like hobbies or things like that they can now actually turn into a full-time job. And they, through UBI, were able to take that leap and create their own business, which is absolutely fantastic. And also UBI had other impacts as well. There was less reliant on people, less reliant on food banks. People were less reliant on even government support. UBI, no matter when you look at all those studies, in fact, there was one, what's the most recent one? I'm sure the most recent one was done in California. But there's ones done in Iceland. I think there was one done in Norway. I think there's one in Denmark. And I think there's one, the most famous one I think done is definitely in Finland. I think that was like the first one. But all these studies have shown just how good UBI can actually be. And now that we've seen the furlough scheme brought in, I think it's generally time we actually start to talk about UBI. Now, I am a supporter of UBI, but I've said in the past before we bring in UBI, there need to be protections brought in. But again, I think that's a different topic for a different time. But we are going to talk about UBI and why I think it's now time to start having this conversation, and something which could actually be a very, very good Labour policy. So, as always, please do remember to hit that like, share and subscribe button. And of course, down below there is a link to my Patreon page, as well as a one-off donation link called Buy Me a Coffee, where you can, well, buy me a coffee. And as always, thank you very much to all those people who do support me that way. And on with the article. So, this comes from The Guardian. And the title is, Furlough was a radical success. Now let's talk about a universal basic income. With an estimated 188,000 job vacancies in the hospitality industry, pub and restaurant owners are starting to complain about the furlough scheme. Specifically, that it has made people lose the will to work. That is highly unlikely. Furlough covered only about 80% of wages, and given what is a struggle to actually keep afloat even on a 100% pay packet, 17.4% of working households are now actually in relative poverty, the highest number this century. Anyone on a minimum wage would actually prefer work to furlough. Arguably, the million people who left the UK since Brexit might have more to do with the labour shortage than our new collective indolence. Workers can always be found if the wages and conditions are right. So it's possible to look for answers in the shortcomings of individual characters than it is in a blind alley. It's interesting though, because this is the argument that's always been used against universal basic income, or UBI. The radical idea of replacing some or all means-tested benefits with a tax-free, unconditional, non-contributory flat amount given to everyone in the country, including children, though at a reduced rate and paid to parents. Most modelling puts this to a similar sum to child benefit pre the coalition government. So why would anyone work if they didn't have to? Before we get to the counter-arguments, both behavioural and practical, pause for a moment just to consider how radical furlough has actually been. From David Cameron's environmental agenda to Boris Johnson's levelling up, the Conservatives are so often said to have parked their tanks on Labour's lawn. It's amazing how often they get away with this, saying whatever is expedient in the electoral moment, abandoning it when it suits them, and for the final trick, doing the exact opposite. What they're actually parking is a papier-mâché tank that is just there for long enough so that the grass dies and Labour forgets where the lawn ever was, or even how to describe it. You can't even blame the Tories for trying it on. Only the smucks who take them seriously. As George Bush would say, fool me once. Exactly. However, the furlough scheme was different, in the sense that it actually happened. It cost real money, 61.3 billion, and it made a real material difference. Most consequentially, if you call 60 billion quid less than entirely consequential, hell, if Rishi Sunak can, so can I. It is embedded in the principle of shared responsibility. If millions are unable to work due to an emergency, there is a collective duty to support them until normality is restored. A parallel principle was also established, that the support isn't the least you can get away with, but rather the most you can afford. The Conservatives didn't change their spots at all. Sick pay was kept so low that it left people in non-furloughed work unable to self-isolate, imperiling tens of thousands of others. Nevertheless, there is a scissor pressure here on public debate, with money is no object from one direction and a reconfiguration of need from the other. Those without wages are people just like us, only with less money. They are not morally compromised or by dint of their hardship. This will seriously complicate the modern benefit narrative. As Stuart Leslie and Howard Reid, the nation's foremost experts on UBI, noted in April last year, furlough and the pandemic generally had an almost immediate impact on the presumptions of this policy. 84% of the public, as well as 110 MPs and peers across 7 parties, support the idea of a recovery basic income. While worldwide there was a surge of interest in an emergency basic income, Spain became the first country in the world to roll out the form of universal basic income on a permanent basis, while Hong Kong, Japan and the US have made significant one-off payments. Wales, meanwhile, has announced a UBI pilot scheme. That will be very interesting to see the results of that. The argument for UBI runs thus. The existing benefit system, devised in the single breadwinner job for life era, no longer meets the needs of the population increasingly dependent on 0 hours and short-term contracts. The flat amount would not be so great as to obliterate work, only to forestall desperation. It would create an upward pressure on stagnant wages, restore bargaining power to workers, and encourage innovation, education, and entrepreneurialships. Various pilot studies have shown only a slight decrease in paid work. In a basic income pilot conducted in the 1970s in Manitoba, Canada, work hours only decreased among new mothers and teenagers. Affordability depends on some varieties, such as the rate of the UBI is set at, and the number of benefits it would replace, and what other changes were made alongside it. Certainly, if you were to undertake such a total reform of the benefit system without looking at housing costs, as again was what we said, the impact would be muted. Conversations so granular were only had at the very fringes of the political debate before the pandemic. So it is simply to consider to actually radically think about. Too radical even for Labour's 2017 or 2019 manifesto, though John McDonnell did talk about a UBI pilot. When you think about how their relatively minded free broadband pledge went down, that's understandable. What Furlough has done then, even if it was by no means universal, and was by its own design reverse means tested, so that the more you had before, the more you got, takes the brakes off the discussion. More importantly, any of the practical objections would that this would stop people working. Why give money to those who don't need it? Wouldn't it dampen the competitive spirit that drives the economy? The wall of impossibilism. That defence has now been breached, and the debate can now truly begin in earnest. And I think that is a very, very good idea. Like I say, the fact that there is a pilot scheme going on in Wales, I'm gonna try and follow that very, very closely, because I think that would be something fantastic to look at. And indeed, I think having a conversation about UBI, how it would work, and the changes that we would need to make in the benefit system would be, I think, a potential change. I think it would be a good idea to make UBI replace the benefit system. I think a complete radical overhaul of it would be really revolutionary in many cases. And I think it's something that we need to actually start to have a talk about. Like, how would it work? What would be the implications for this? What other changes would we need to make? These are the conversations that we need to happen. And of course, we need to think about policy as well. What policy changes do we need to bring in? Housing being the big one. Do we need to think about rent controls, for example? Maybe putting a cap on how much people can actually charge to rent somewhere out. Do we put this in the hands of the government, so it's nationwide, or do we put it in the hands of local councils to set the rate of rent? Again, all these are conversations that, again, we could have, and all this can be focused around UBI. So I think there is a massive cause to actually start a serious conversation about having UBI and how it would work in the UK. So, as always, thank you very much for watching. Please do remember to hit that like, share and subscribe button. And of course, down below, please do remember to hit that... please do remember to have a look into the... I forgot what it was called then. Please do remember to check out my Patreon page. And of course, my one-off donation link as well, called Buy Me a Coffee, where you can, well, buy me a coffee. And as always, thank you very much for watching. And we'll see you all next time.